The water came from the wrong direction, and that was the first thing Roland Ferris understood. Standing hip-deep in the roar of it at 2 in the morning with the rain driving sideways off the ridge, that the flood pouring through his mother's bottomland was not coming down Antler Creek, the way 60 years of floods had come, slow and brown and from the west, but was sheeting in hard and fast from the north. From the base of the new development, at a volume no natural storm on this watershed had ever produced. He knew it the way other men know a wrong note in a familiar song, because reading water was the thing he had done with his whole life, and everything about this water was wrong. He waded toward the barn, the 1938 timber barn his grandfather had raised by hand, and he got the loft doors open and drove what cattle he could reach up onto the high ground, and he stood in the flooded alley with the current pulling at his thighs and watched the northwest corner post, set in dry-laid stone 87 years before, lean and shudder and go. The barn came down into the water almost gently. Somewhere in the dark, his mother's stock pond levee failed, with a sound like a held breath, letting go. And Roland Ferris, 66 years old, soaked to the bone and shaking with cold and something colder, did not shout and did not weep. He turned and looked north, toward the bright security lights of Highland Reserve glowing through the rain, and he thought with the flat professional certainty of a man who had spent 32 years modeling exactly this, that someone had built this flood on purpose, and that whoever it was did not yet know that they had just routed 100 million gallons of engineered stormwater across the bottomland of the one rancher in the state who had spent his career proving, in courtrooms, precisely where a flood came from and precisely whose hand it. Within the year, a judge would tell that person the same thing, in language that cost them $14 million and their board. To understand how it came to this, it helps to go back not to the flood, but to 1936, when Roland's grandfather, Walt Ferris, filed on 1,040 acres of grass and cottonwood bottom along Antler Creek in Brannock County and began the slow work of turning raw country into a ranch that could feed a family. Walt raised the first barn in 1938 and the homestead in 1941, and he ran cattle on the uplands. But it was Roland's mother, Della, who made the place what it became. Widowed at 41 and left with a half-worked ranch and a 9-year-old son, Della Ferris did not sell and did not remarry. She read the land instead. She spent 30 years learning where the water wanted to go on that bottomland, and then, with a borrowed dozer and an intuition no engineer ever taught her, gently persuading it, a system of shallow swales and spreader dikes and 3 stock ponds that turned 300 acres of flood-prone bottom into the most productive irrigated hay ground in the county, worth, by the end, a great part of what would make the ranch a $6 million place. She built it by feel, the way some people build a life, walking the bottom in her rubber boots after every rain to see what the water had done and what it wanted, and she made her son promise, in the last clear week before the cancer took her at 79, the one thing she had ever asked of him: keep the bottom. Not the uplands, not the house, not the money, the bottom, the water-shaped ground she had spent her life teaching to hold instead of flood. Roland had left that ground young, for a career his mother never fully understood but quietly approved of: hydrology. 32 years as a water resources engineer and floodplain modeler. First for a state dam safety office, and then as a court-qualified expert who reconstructed the causes of floods for judges and juries, a man who could take a storm and a set of grading plans and tell you to the cubic foot per second where the water had gone and why. He came home when Della was dying, and he stayed, and he kept the bottom the way she had taught him, until the night a stranger's development sent the water back. Sabrina Holt was 50, and she was, by her own account and the account of every lender she had ever charmed, a person who moved dirt and made money. She had come up through residential land sales and then development, and she had a real and dangerous gift for making a balance sheet feel like a destiny. She was president of the Highland Reserve Community Association and the principal of Virail Land and Development, and she had staked everything on the ridge above Antler Creek, 240 custom homes rising in 3 phases on 800 acres of former grassland, carried on a loan from Keystone Mutual Bank and pre-sold on the strength of a lifestyle brochure. But grassland absorbs rain and rooftops and roads do not, and Phase 2 had generated a volume of stormwater that the county's own rules required her to capture and release slowly, through a detention basin and a compliant drainage design that her engineers had prepared and that would have cost, by the estimate she scrawled a red line through, $2,800,000. Sabrina Holt did not like that number, and below the ridge, inconveniently, lay the Ferris bottomland, low, green, other people's, and it occurred to her, in the way such things occur to people who have never once been told no by anyone who mattered, that gravity had already solved her problem for free. She had the design value engineered. The detention basin shrunk to a decorative pond, the drainage regraded, a 48-inch culvert set to gather the whole developed watershed and aim it, concentrated and accelerated, down a regraded swale and across the Ferris bottom. It would save her $2.5 million. It would also, on the first big storm, drown 300 acres of another family's life's work. And Sabrina had decided, in the quiet arithmetic she never said aloud to anyone, that this was not a cost but an opportunity, because a flooded ranch would sell to her when the time came for a great deal less than $6 million. On her first and only visit to Roland's gate, when he raised the drainage question directly, she had smiled and said the thing that would come back to bury her. That water went where water went, that gravity was not a conspiracy, and that a man who owned the low ground ought to have made his peace with downhill a long time ago. The pressure began, as it always does, dressed as procedure. The first letter came from the Highland Reserve Association, which had no authority over the Ferris Ranch at all, asserting watershed management coordination and assessing a $400 drainage nonconformance fee against Roland's Creek crossing. He declined to pay it and photographed the letter and its postmark and slid both into a manila folder labeled in pencil with the date, the first of what would become 17 folders. The second letter demanded he modify his lower fences to accommodate seasonal flow. The third, certified, hinted at liens, and by the time it arrived the invented drainage fee balance had climbed to $4,800 from a $400 start, a number Roland logged with the same flat attention he gave a falling barometer. In the 9th month, a Vireo crew accidentally bladed a shallow trench across the top of his north fence line, a cut that did nothing but aim a little more water his way, and when he photographed it, a foreman told him it was county drainage work and to take it up with the county. And then the construction started in earnest on the ridge, and Roland, who understood exactly what he was watching, began to document it not as a victim, but as an expert building a case no one yet knew existed. He photographed the shrinking detention basin and the growing culvert. He filed a formal written objection with the county, dated and certified, warning in precise hydrologic language that the built design would convey the developed runoff directly onto his bottomland. The county, understaffed and lobbied, let it pass. And because reading water was what he did the thing that would eventually end Sabrina Holt. He installed his own instrumentation. 3 stream gauges along the bottom and 2 tipping bucket rain gauges, logging depth and flow and rainfall to the minute, quietly for months before the flood, building a baseline record of exactly how his mother's ground behaved under every ordinary rain. He kept the folders growing, past 800 photographs and a season of gauge data, an archive assembled with the unhurried patience of a man who understood that a flood causation case is not won in the water, but in the boring, meticulous, time-stamped record of before and after. He said nothing to Sabrina about what he had been. That was the point. 2 people were building a record across that watershed, and only one of them knew what a record like this was worth. And it was not the woman with the red pen. What Sabrina could not have known, what no brochure could have told her, was what the bottomland actually was to the man she had decided to flood. Every evening Roland walked his mother's swales the way she had walked them, reading the ground, and every evening it was Della's voice he heard, "Keep the bottom," the promise made in a room that smelled of cut hay and dying. The fines and the letters in the red-lined plans were not, to him, about creek crossings or fences or the drainage code. They were about whether a promise made to a dying woman whose whole life was written into the shape of 300 acres could survive a person who had never in her life kept a promise she couldn't discount. That was the true fight, and it was his alone, and he meant to win it the slow way. Without shouting, without giving Sabrina Holt the satisfaction of his fear, 1 gauge reading and 1 photographed postmark at a time. It was his old colleague Lionel Chow who finally said the quiet part aloud. Lionel had modeled floods beside Roland for 24 years and had retired to a house on a reservoir he had helped design, and he drove out on a Sunday and read the 17 folders and the gauge log spread across the kitchen table in the long gold light of a September evening. Lionel went very still as he read. He understood, faster than any jury would, exactly what he was looking at. When he reached the shrunken basin photographs and the 48-inch culvert aimed like a rifle at the Ferris bottom, he set down his coffee and let out a slow breath because he knew who was sitting across from him. He knew that Roland Ferris had spent 32 years as a hydrologist and floodplain engineer, that he had reconstructed the causation of more than 200 floods and testified as a court-qualified expert in 5 states, that there was no storm he could not separate from its consequences and no developer's claim of act of God he had not personally dismantled on a witness stand, by showing the jury, in cubic feet per second, exactly how much of the water was God's and how much was the defendant's. He knew that Roland had been gauging his own ground for months, that he had a baseline no opposing expert could manufacture, and that Sabrina Holt was, at that very moment, building the most expensive mistake of her life out of concrete and fill. She thinks she found a rancher who owns the low ground, Final said. She found the one man in the country who can stand in a courtroom and prove her culvert did it. He shook his head slowly. She could not have picked a worse man to flood. Roland did not smile. He told Lionel about a case from their early years, a subdivision that had drowned a trailer park and sworn on the stand that a 1,000-year rain was to blame, until Roland put the actual gauge record beside their design and the whole act of God defense dissolved into a number the jury could read for themselves. People who move water and lie about it, he said, always make the same mistake. They believe the water will keep their secret. It never does. It writes everything down. He looked out toward the dark shape of the barn his grandfather had built, and the swales his mother had shaped beyond it, and said only that he hoped the storm would hold off long enough for the county to make her fix it, and that he did not believe it would. He said it the way a man says a thing. He is already grieved in advance. He was right. The storm did not hold off, and it did not need to be a large one, which was the cruelest and most useful fact of all. 10 months into Sabrina's campaign, on a night in June, a thoroughly ordinary storm moved across Brannock County and dropped 3 1/10 inches of rain in 6 hours. A storm his gauges would later peg at roughly a 10-year event, the kind of rain his mother's bottomland had shrugged off 100 times in 90 years. But this time the rain did not fall on grassland. It fell on Phase 2's rooftops and roads, gathered in the 48-inch culvert, and came down the regraded swale onto the Ferris bottom at a rate his gauges clocked at 1,100 cubic feet per second. Many times what that ground had ever seen, and it drowned 300 acres, took the 1938 barn, breached the lower stock pond, and washed 62 head of cattle down the bottom in the dark. It was not a natural flood. It was a designed one, and it arrived precisely where and how Roland Ferris had warned the county in writing that it would. He spent that night saving what stock he could, and the next 3 days reading the wreckage the way he had read 200 flood scenes before it. The debris lines, the scour patterns, the direction of the silt, the high water marks his gauges had already recorded to the minute, and he photographed all of it and touched nothing he did not have to. Sabrina came on the 4th day in a spotless jacket, ostensibly to express concern, actually to make an offer. She stood on the ruined edge of the bottom and told him how terrible it was, how these low places simply flooded, how she might be persuaded to take the damaged bottomland off his hands and spare him the heartbreak of it. And then, because she could not help herself, because she believed she was speaking to a beaten old rancher who would take pennies and go, she said the thing she did not know. 2 of his gauge sight cameras were recording. "I didn't send that water anywhere," she said, easy and certain. "Water runs downhill. That's gravity, not Highland Reserve. Though I'll tell you what, a flooded ranch sells for a lot less than $6 million. You ought to think about that before your next no." Then she left him her card on a fence post and drove back up to her dry ridge, certain she had finally found the number the stubborn old man would answer to. Roland pocketed the card. He did not call her. He called Naomi Blackwood. Naomi was the Ferris family's attorney, a water and land litigator with a small firm in Redbud, and a reputation for never filing a case she had not already won on the documents. She had handled Della's estate. She knew the ranch, and when Roland laid the 17 folders, the gauge logs, the flood scene analysis, and the recording across her table and walked her through it in the flat, precise voice of a man narrating a hydrograph, she understood within the hour that she was not holding a bad weather claim. She was holding a documented 10-month campaign, an engineered flood he had warned the county about in writing before it happened, and a defendant who had confessed the motive and the coercion into 2 cameras. Naomi brought in the county's own floodplain engineer, a careful public servant named Vernon Slate, precisely so the case would not rest on the word of the victim, however expert. Slate built his own independent model of the watershed, ran the June storm through both the compliant design and the design Sabrina had actually built, and confirmed what Roland already knew to the cubic foot. Under the lawful design, the Ferris bottom would have seen a minor, survivable rise. Under the built design, it saw a catastrophe. The flood was not the rain's doing. It was the culverts. And a state water resources investigator named Dev Basu, reviewing the same record, opened a file on the unlawful obstruction and diversion of a natural watercourse, because what Sabrina had done was not merely negligent. It was, in the plain language of the state water code, a crime. The reckoning accelerated when the pressure inside Vireo broke a decent person loose. His name was Curtis Yu, and he was the civil engineer who had designed the Highland Reserve drainage, and he had been unable to sleep since the June storm. Curtis had prepared the compliant design, Plan A, the real detention basin. And he had watched Sabrina redline it into Plan B, and he had put his objection in writing, and he had been overruled. And now, 300 acres and a family's barn were gone exactly as he had warned. When he learned the state had opened a file, Curtis Yu copied everything to a drive and carried it into Naomi Blackwood's office in a document box because he could not carry it alone for one more day. What he surrendered did not prove negligence. It proved intent, in Sabrina's own words. There were the two sets of plans, the compliant one shelved and the cheap one built. There was the cost comparison, $2,800,000 against $300,000, the savings circled. And there was the document that made even Vernon's slate set down his pen. Curtis's own design memo, warning in black and white that the value-engineered alternative will convey the developed 100-year discharge directly across the Ferris bottomland and should not be constructed. And beneath it, in the margin, Sabrina Holt's emailed reply, 4 sentences she had believed only a subordinate would ever read. Build the alternative. The rancher's drainage is the rancher's problem, not ours. And a wet ranch is a cheap ranch. We'll own the bottom by spring. We'll own the bottom by spring. She had written down her plan and her motive and her contempt in a single email, and it now sat in a state investigator's file beside a recording of her calling the flood gravity and 2 independent hydrologic models proving it was not. The public confirmation came at the Brannock County Drainage Commission on a Tuesday evening 5 weeks later, where Sabrina, who still did not know Curtis had defected, that the memo was in evidence, that her gravity speech had been recorded, sought after the fact approval of the Phase 2 drainage as built. She addressed the commission with the frictionless confidence of a woman who had never lost a room, describing the June flood as an unfortunate act of nature and Highland Reserve as a model of responsible development. Then the floor opened and a quiet man in a canvas jacket rose from the back and asked, so mildly the clerk had to ask him to lean toward the microphone, whether he might put a few questions to Ms. Holt for the record. He asked her whether the drainage that had been built matched the drainage the county had originally approved. She said developments evolved and that the built system met the spirit of the requirements. He asked whether she had been advised in writing by her own engineer that the built design would flood the neighboring bottomland. She said engineers were paid to worry and that worrying was not the same as knowing. He asked finally whether she still believed, as she had said at his gate the year before, that the water on his land was simply gravity's doing and no concern of hers. And Sabrina Holt, who did not know the man asking, had spent 32 years proving in court exactly whose concern such water was, looked out at a ruined man she believed she had already beaten, and told the public commission on a public recording that yes, water ran downhill, that it always had and always would, that Highland Reserve had built to a reasonable standard and could not be held responsible for the shape of God's own topography, and that if the low ground flooded, the low ground had always been going to flood and its owner would be wise to sell it to someone who understood that. It was, nearly word for word, what she had said at the gate and what she had written in the margin of the memo, and what she had said on the ruined edge of the bottom. The same conviction, repeated so often it no longer registered to her as a confession. Roland thanked her and sat down and said nothing more. She had just narrated her intent, under her own name, on a public recording, for the 4th documented time. The case reached the Brannock County District Court the following spring, and it was, by design, the least dramatic proceeding imaginable, because Naomi Blackwood had built it to be inevitable rather than exciting. There were no ambushes and no theatrics, only the slow, rhythmic, unanswerable presentation of a truth that had been waiting in 17 folders and a season of gauge data for its turn to be seen. She laid it out the way a flood is reconstructed from the storm outward. First the rain itself, 3 1/10 inches, a 10-year event, a storm the Ferris bottom had survived 100 times, established by Roland's own rain gauges and the county's records both. Then the 2 designs, the compliant one shelved and the cheap one built, and the $2.5 million saved by the difference. Then the hydrology, Roland Ferris on the stand, walking the jury cubic foot by cubic foot through the pre-development flow and the post-development flow and the 1,100 cubic feet per second his gauges had clocked coming out of a culvert that gathered a watershed and aimed it at his mother's ground, a case no opposing expert could touch because the man presenting it had spent a lifetime teaching courts how to trust exactly this kind of number. Corroborated line by the county's own engineer, Vernon Slate. Then the flood scene, the scour and the silt and the high water marks. Then Curtis Yu's memo and Sabrina's margin note. And then, in a silent courtroom, they played the recording from the ruined edge of the bottom, and the county heard Sabrina Holt call 100 million gallons of engineered stormwater gravity and tell a broken man that a wet ranch was a cheap ranch and that he ought to think about that before his next no. Sabrina's attorneys tried, at the midpoint, the only pivot available, that the June storm had been an act of God, that Highland Reserve had built in good faith to an approved concept, that flooding of low ground was an act of God, that Highland Reserve had built in good faith to a night beg bap. It was not a hopeless theory in the abstract. It survived exactly as long as it took Roland Ferris to put the two hydrographs on the screen side by side. The survivable rise the lawful design would have produced, and the catastrophe the built design did produce, from the identical storm, and then to lay beside them Curtis Yo's memo in which the flood had been predicted, in writing, before it happened. An act of God, the judge would observe, does not come with an engineer's warning and a margin note ordering it built anyway. The pivot collapsed. What remained was the ruling delivered in the flat formal language such moments demand, that the defendants had unlawfully obstructed of natural watercourse and had done so intentionally with knowledge and forethought to damage the plaintiff's land and depress its value for acquisition, that compensatory damages of $6,200,000 would enter for the destruction of the bottomland, the structures, and the herd, that punitive damages would bring the judgment to $14 million, that the defendants were permanently enjoined and ordered to remediate the soul exploited. It was the word dissolved and the number 14 million that finally emptied the confidence from Sabrina Holt's face. The dominoes did not fall so much as detonate. Keystone Mutual Bank, learning that its borrower stood under a $14 million intentional tort judgment and estate diversion investigation, called the Highland Reserve loan within the week and moved on its collateral. The association's insurer, its policy excluding intentional acts, denied coverage and left the directors personally exposed. Barrio Land and Development filed for protection from its creditors before the summer was out, its remaining lots and equipment auctioned in slices. The receiver took control of Highland Reserve, and the homeowners, who had bought into Sabrina's brand and now found themselves owning a share of her judgment, learned the hard difference between a community and a scheme. And Sabrina Holt, who had bet everything on a single assumption that the old rancher would take the flood money and went to answer the state's investigation, having never once imagined that the man she chose to flood did not want the money, had never wanted the money, and had only ever wanted to keep 300 acres of his mother's ground, doing the quiet thing she had taught it to do. Roland did not gloat. This surprised people who did not know him, and did not surprise Lionel Cho in the slightest. When a reporter from the county weekly came out hoping for a triumphant quote, Roland offered her a seat on the porch and a cup of coffee and said only that he had not won anything, that the water had kept its own record, the way water always does for anyone patient enough to gauge it, and that all he had done was keep his mother's promise long enough for the numbers to catch up. The victory had a quiet, expanding tail. Other victims surfaced as they always do once the first one falls. Two families downstream who had also flooded that June and who had been told by Sabrina's people that it was simply a wet year came forward, and Roland, who had spent his life making water tell the truth, modeled their properties without charge and showed their lawyers how the same culvert had reached them too. A rancher on the far side of the ridge came forward who had sold Sabrina his creek frontage cheap after a wet season 3 years before, and Roland helped him understand, at last, that the season had not been an accident. And when the man's old gaugeless records were run through Roland's model, the pattern was unmistakable, and it joined the state's growing file. Word of it moved through the county the way water moves through low ground, finding every channel, and for a season Roland's kitchen table became a kind of quiet clearinghouse, flooded families arriving with waterlogged photographs and insurance denials, learning from a retired man in a canvas coat that the disaster they had been told to accept as weather had all along been someone's decision. And the neighbors came, one and two at a time, people who had signed Highland Reserve's petitions, who had believed the woman with the brochures over the quiet man with the gauges. A man named Garth Alvey, who had let Sabrina run her survey across his fence line, stood at the edge of the drying bottom, unable to meet Roland's eye, and said he was sorry, that he should have listened years ago. Roland told him to come up and sit a while, and that was the whole of the reckoning, because to a man who had kept a promise to the dead, the living owed nothing but their honesty going forward. The bottomland drained and dried through that long summer, and Roland Ferris spent it rebuilding by hand. He would not let the receiver's contractors do the part that mattered. The court had ordered them to remediate the culvert and the grading, and they did. But the swales and the spreader dikes his mother had shaped by feel he recut himself, walking the ground the way she had, reading where the water wanted to go and gently persuading it, a section at a time, back into the patient system that had held for 60 years before a stranger tried to weaponize it. He raised a new barn on the old stone footings his grandfather had laid, matching the timber frame as near as he could, and he reseeded the scoured ground, and by the second cutting the bottom was green again and holding water instead of losing it. He was clearing silt from the base of the old homestead when his shovel turned up a flat tin his mother had buried there, wrapped in oilcloth, decades before. And inside, dry and perfect, was Della Ferris's hand-drawn map of the whole water system. Every swale and dike and pond in her careful hand, 40 years of learning where the water wanted to go set down in pencil that had not faded. And folded into the back of it, a note she must have left in some private hour of her last year, in the round, deliberate script Roland would have known anywhere. Water isn't your enemy, and it isn't your servant, she had written. It's your neighbor. Learn where it wants to go, and it will never once turn on you. And don't ever let anyone tell you they can make it lie. Keep the bottom. He read it kneeling in the drying silt, with the new barn rising pale behind him and the swales running clear and slow the way she had taught them to run. And he understood, finally and completely, that he had. He set the map back in its tin and buried it again at the foot of the homestead, for whoever came after, and then he walked the length of the restored bottom in the evening light, and thought about the two of them, the woman who had believed she could shout at water and call it gravity, and the people who had spent their lives learning to listen to it instead. Sabrina Holt had come with brochures and a red pen and the loud, portable, purchasable certainty of someone who thought a watershed was a line item and a promise was a discount. She was gone now, her development in receivership, her name a $14 million judgment, her board dissolved. And the Ferris Bottom had not become anyone's cheap acquisition after all. It had stayed what 3 generations of patient hands had made it. What a dying woman had asked it to remain. 300 acres of ground that had been taught, with love and a borrowed dozer, to hold. Because that, in the end, was the whole of it. The thing Della had known with her feet, in the mud, and Roland had spent a career proving with his instruments, and the water itself had known all along. That false authority is always loud, always certain, always sure it can regrade the truth and blame the result on gravity, while the water keeps its own quiet and perfect record, and does exactly and only what it was engineered to do, and remembers, without hurry and without mercy, every hand that ever tried to send it somewhere was never meant to go,